genius is like a forest, wherein the free and fruitful nature spreads her richness. Art is like a garden, wherein everything happens according to method, and one is subjected to rules which precede. Whereas in the genius, nature gives matter and example to rules. Immanuel Kant. In the last lecture, I talked about Kant's concept of genius, which he translates as original spirit, because to him, genius is about originality. Meaning that the genius doesn't just imitate, doesn't just follow rules that can be learned, like the mechanical artist, but rather the genius produces something completely new and original. But unlike the madman, the genius doesn't produce original nonsense, but rather the genius produces something which can be exemplary. So, while he himself doesn't imitate, others might then be influenced by the genius and imitate him. And other geniuses, while not imitating the genius, will be inspired by his products and follow him. And also, the genius is sort of something that comes from nature. It is a talent, as Kant says. So a natural gift. It is something that cannot be learned, because again, the genius doesn't consciously follow rules that you could learn, that you could be taught, but rather it just comes to the genius. It just comes through inspiration. So it is, in a way, it is nature itself working through the genius. And I also said that to Kant, genius is mostly him who produces the beautiful art. In the stricter sense, genius is restricted to that. In the stricter sense, there is no such thing as scientific genius, because what the scientific genius comes up with is something that once it is there, once it has been invented, it can be learned and reproduced by others. So I also said that in a wider sense, you could also talk of genius here, because here too you have a sort of natural originality that the genius himself can't exactly explain to himself or know how he produced it. But in this lecture, when talking about genius, I will talk about the genius in the narrow sense, so the artistic genius. Because so far I gave what Kant would call a name explanation. So basically a definition what a genius is. But how exactly does this original spirit work? What is it made up of? Well, Kant says that the genius consists mainly of 4 faculties. Mainly, he says there could also be other faculties and abilities of our mind playing into it. But mostly, the genius consists of 4 faculties, he says. And those are what he calls spirit, the power of imagination, the intellect, and taste. And he likes to compare them to the parts of a tree. The spirit being the fruit of the tree, the power of imagination representing the tree top or the crown of the tree, the intellect making up the roots of the tree, and taste being the flower, the blossoms of the tree. I will point out that genius being made up of those 4 specific faculties, the spirit, the power of imagination, the intellect, and the taste, is something that Kant writes in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, which is written rather late in his life. often you will find Kant using other words when you go through his notes or through his lectures that he gave throughout the earlier years. It's rather consistent that he says spirit and taste are part of genius, but in place of the power of imagination, in earlier works you will find him say sensation, or even at some point he just says sensuality. And in place of intellect, you will often find him say power of judgment is needed. He will always say there are 4 components, and 2 of those components, as I said, are rather consistent. The other 2, he changed the words he was using throughout his thinking. But I think that is more a change of words to be more precise than it is a change of content. Because whether Kant talks about the power of imagination being part of the genius, or whether he talks about sensation or sensuality being part of the genius, what is consistent is that he always says, well, there is a sensual component, right? And whether, on the other hand, he says intellect is part of the genius, or whether he says the power of judgment is part of the genius, what is consistent is that there's always an intellectual component, always a thinking component. It just seems to me that Kant over time got more precise, got a better understanding of which part of our sensuality and which part of our intellectuality, namely the power of imagination and the intellect, is part of genius. So I will go here with what the late Kant said and with the words that he used. I'm just adding this so that if anyone goes through the writings of the earlier Kant, you don't get confused or you don't think that he's expressing a different opinion. I just think he's expressing a not yet as refined opinion. But anyways, let us go through those 4 components. And I think it is most fitting to start with the intellect, since after all, Kant says the intellect sort of represents the roots of the tree. So let us start from the bottom. Why is the intellect a root? Well, because the intellect to Kant is, after all, the faculty of concepts. I talked about the intellect in another lecture already, so you can check that out if you want. The intellect is the faculty of concepts, and through those concepts we understand what a thing is. So we need the intellect to know what something is. And clearly, if you want to be an artist and produce a work of art, you need to have a concept of your work of art. You need to know what exactly it is that you want to represent with your art, right? So if you are Da Vinci painting the Last Supper, you need to know that you are painting the Last Supper and what the Last Supper is. You need to have a correct concept of that. You need to know, okay, it means they are eating. It means there's Jesus and he is probably the center of it all. It means there are 12 other guys present, right? If you don't have a correct concept of the Last Supper, like if you don't know how many disciples there were, if you painted with, let's say, just 9 disciples, then even if your painting technique is great, even if as a general painting of people eating it might be a good painting, it will not be a good painting of the Last Supper, because the Last Supper didn't include 9 disciples, it included 12 disciples. And again, this goes for any artist, right? If you Vivaldi wanting to compose music representing the four seasons, you must have a concept of those four seasons. If you're Miyazaki wanting to create a movie about young love, like Whisper of the Heart, you need to have a concept of that. So you need to understand what it is that you want to depict. Kant would say that when we judge beauty, when we judge something beautiful, when it comes to the beautiful in nature, we don't need concepts to judge it. I already talked about that in my lectures on what is beauty and what is taste. I explained how Kant would say to find a flower beautiful, I don't need to know what kind of flower it is. I don't need to have a concept of it being a rose or a tulip or a lily or whatever. And also, I don't need to have a concept of what the blossom is. I don't need to know that it is the sexual organ of the flower, that it is used for the flower reproducing its species. I don't need to have an understanding of those things to judge that this is a beautiful flower. But when it comes to the beauty of art, Kant says, we cannot merely judge the form. Beauty is in the form. Again, I explained that in the lecture on beauty. But still, to judge whether a work of art is perfect or whether it is imperfect, whether it is lacking as a work of art, it is not enough to merely know the form, to merely know what it looks like or sound like. I also, to judge it, need to have a concept of what it is meant to depict. Like if I have a painting of a man, I need to know who this man is supposed to be. If the artist here wanted to paint Jesus, or if here he wanted to paint Judas, he needs to paint different people. Like a good painting of Jesus has to express his holiness, Kant would say. It has to have a certain expression of kindness, of goodness, of compassion, of also of serenity. While on the other hand, if you want to depict Judas, you must exactly not depict those qualities. He must not look like a holy person. So something that would be a good painting of Jesus, if it was meant to be a depiction of Judas, you could judge the very same painting to be a bad painting. So whether a work of art is good or not does depend on concepts, does depend on our intellect and our understanding of what it is supposed to show and what it isn't supposed to show. Now that is why the intellect makes up the root in the tree that is genius, because like the tree grows out of the root, everything else in a beautiful work of art grows out of the intellect. Without a concept of the intellect, the artwork, the depiction, would not be the depiction of something. We first need to know what something we want to depict as an artist. But just like a root by itself is not a tree, intellect by itself isn't enough to be a genius, to be a great artist. Because if you just understand what you want to depict, that doesn't mean that you can depict it in a good work of art. And intellect alone could also be used not for art, but for science, right? You could also write a treatise on your thing that you want to depict. If you just have a concept of, again, let's say the Last Supper, you could write a treatise on the Last Supper. You could describe what is happening in the Bible. If you just have a concept of the four seasons, you could write about the four seasons and what they are. And such a scientific treatise, if you have a good intellect, if you have a clear, precise concept, could even be a perfect treatise. It could have its own sort of perfection, but that would be what Kant calls logical perfection. It would not be aesthetical perfection. But of course, the artwork needs aesthetical perfection. Which leads us to the second component, to the power of judgment, which, as I already said, makes up the treetop or the crown of the tree. Because aesthetics to Kant is always about viewing in a way. I mean, that's also where the word comes from. The Greek aesthesis does mean something like viewing or intuition. So Kant also says at some point that aesthetics could be called as a science the logic of the feeling, just like actual logic is the logic of the intellect. But he would say that aesthetics can never truly be a science, precisely because it is not discursive but intuitive. So we cannot give rules, we cannot have concepts about it, we cannot intellectualize and understand how a product of art should look like in order to be beautiful and how it mustn't look like in order to not be ugly. So aesthetics can never be a true science that helps us produce the beautiful. It can only, Kant says, it can only be a critic of the beautiful or of the products of art. But anyway, so aesthetics is about viewing. It needs, therefore, some sort of sensuality, right? An artwork cannot merely consist of concepts, of things that you can think, that you can understand. It needs in some way or another to be sensual, whether it's visual artwork or whether it is about sounds like in music, but there needs to be some sort of sensuality in it. Now still, the concept does make up the root, the basis, the fundament of the genius. So you do need logical perfection, Kant would say, but you also need aesthetical perfection. And genius is exactly about being able to, in a way, connect and combine logical with aesthetical perfection. To give to a concept a viewable, essential expression which doesn't just merely illustrate that concept, but goes beyond that concept. Not against the concept, however. It still fits to the concept, but it needs to go beyond the concept. Like the tree going out of the wood, expanding its branches and its leaves in all directions, having a wide crown, a wide top. And this is where the power of imagination comes into play, because the genius, in order for the work of art to be something aesthetical, to be something that can be viewed, needs to have a sensual component. But sensuality to Kant has two parts. I gave a lecture already about sensuality and the forms of viewing where I discussed these two parts. The two parts are the sense and the power of imagination. And the sense to Kant is the faculty that lets us view what is there, what is given to us. The general term is sense, but of course we have different senses like our seeing, our hearing, our smelling. Um, but sense only lets us, sense whatever is already there and whatever affects us. So that means that, of course, sense is needed when we judge the beautiful, including the beautiful in art. We cannot judge a beautiful artwork, we cannot appreciate it without sense, right? So a blind person will not be able to appreciate a beautiful painting. A deaf person will not be able to appreciate beautiful music. But genius, after all, is not about judging art, it is about producing art. And here, obviously, we don't need simply sense, we need that other part of our sensuality, which again is the power of imagination. And here, again, I discussed that in my lecture on sensuality. Kant says the power of imagination can work in two ways. It can be the reproductive power of imagination, as the name suggests, reproducing what we have viewed before, like, for example, in memory. But it can also be the productive power of imagination. And I think it is quite clear and doesn't need a lot of explaining that when it comes to genius, what is needed is productive power of imagination. As a side note, to clarify, of course, the genius also needs senses. Of course, you need sense not just to judge an artwork that is already there, but also to produce it, because you, of course, need your senses to gather up the material for your power of imagination, right? If you were born blind, if you have never seen colors, you have no material for painting. But still, the actual process of producing that painting will not require your senses. Once you have that material, you can sort of create the painting in your own mind. On the other hand, you of course also need senses to check if what you're doing is right. Like the painter has this image of the painting he wants to create in his mind, but now he needs to get that image onto the canvas. So of course he will need his eyes to check if he is drawing the correct lines, if he's using the correct colors. But this is the mechanical side of art. Genius is just about, to Kant, it is just about the production of, let's say, the image, the inner image of the artwork, being able to actually bring that out into the world so that not you see it inside of yourself, but others can see it too. That is the mechanical side of art. That doesn't require genius. That is something that can actually be learned, right? You can learn painting, you can learn playing music and so on. And sure, for that mechanical side, you need your senses to check if you are doing the, let's say, the technique correctly. But I mean, you could imagine an artist who was so highly skilled in the mechanical side. You could imagine a great genius who wouldn't even need his senses anymore. Like, you could imagine a painter who wasn't born blind, because, again, then he would not have material for his painting. But you could imagine a painter who turned blind and still was able to paint because he was such a master in painting that it was enough for him to sort of see the image in front of his inner eye, and he is so good at painting the right lines, the right strokes, that he doesn't even need to see what he is painting. You could at least imagine such a person. And indeed, when it comes to music, we have such an example in Beethoven, right? Who in his later life turned deaf, but still could compose. He didn't even need to hear his composition to sort of double check what he was doing. it was enough to sort of hear it in front of his inner ear, to just know what he was composing and how it was supposed to sound like. But anyway, surely to gather up material and also for the mechanical process of bringing forth your inner image, you do need senses. But for actually using that material to actually create that inner image that you then want to turn into an artwork, you don't need sense. You need the productive power of imagination. But productive power of imagination is not enough, because this productive power of imagination also plays a role in the process of making experience. I talked about this in my lecture on apprehension, because as Kant explains, what we get through our senses, the sensations, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the feelings, they are apprehended, meaning they are taken in, they are taken up by our productive power of imagination, which forms them into an image that we can then understand through a concept of the intellect. Here, in this process of experience, Kant calls this power of imagination the empirical power of imagination. And he says that here it is under the direction of the intellect. It is not free to produce whatever it wants, but it can only produce the image of that thing in front of us, which is affecting us. It can only produce an image of that thing which we can then understand through our intellect. Here, when it does its work of apprehending, this power of imagination sort of just illustrates our thoughts, or the other way around, it sort of just gives an image which we can then give a description to with our intellect. But that is not what happens in art, right? If your productive power of imagination was just empirical here, if it was just used to illustrate the concepts of the intellect, then yes, it would produce something sensual, something viewable, but that sensual image would not be considered beautiful art, and he who produces it would not be considered a genius. Think of an anatomy book. Here you have concepts, you have descriptions, you have something you can think, and these concepts are illustrated. You have images of the human body, of the organs, of the bones, and so on. But these are just mere illustrations of the concepts. They are nothing more. They don't go beyond those concepts they are supposed to illustrate, and therefore we may find them correct as illustrations of the concepts, but we won't find them particularly beautiful. And we would certainly not say that he who illustrated this anatomy book is therefore a genius. No, the productive power of imagination in the genius needs to be free, Kant says. It needs to be truly creative. That means it must not be bound by the intellect. It must go above and beyond the intellect with its concepts. It is as if it was following not the intellect, as it usually does, Kant says, but rather as if it was following our reason. Because reason, and I also already gave a lecture on reason, reason to Kant is the higher faculty of thinking. It is the faculty of thinking not just concepts, but principles. It is the faculty of thinking the absolute, of thinking totality. It is a concept of thinking the supersensual, something that makes us always go beyond sensuality, beyond the limited, the finite, and the conditioned. And it is a faculty that makes us think the unconditioned, makes us demand sort of the condition of all the conditioned things. And here in Genius, again, it is as if his power of imagination was not following the intellect, but this higher faculty of thinking, this reason. The power of imagination in the two artists is creative because it doesn't just illustrate his concepts, it doesn't just produce an image which fits the concepts. Again, of course, it has to fit the concept. It has to not contradict the concept, or else it would not be a good work of art. But it has to be more than merely the concept. It goes beyond it. So Kant would say that it adds to the concept other sensual representations which don't belong directly to that concept, which go beyond that concept, and which in us, if we view the work of art, produce certain reactions which make our own mind, in his thoughts, in its feelings, go beyond the mere concept expressed in this word of art. I would say, this is not Kant's expression, this is mine, but in a way, it seems to me what Kant is saying is that the true work of art makes us, as its viewers, become artists in a way while we are viewing it. It sort of inspires us to, if not in reality through producing works of art of our own, then at least in our own minds, keep creating that work of art which we are looking at, creating it forth, adding to it through our own representations. Indeed, this interpretation fits with what Kant says about the influence geniuses have on other geniuses. After all, and I already addressed that in the last lecture on the genius, he says that while another genius will not imitate the genius that came before him, he will follow him. He will be inspired by his products. In a way, you could say that there are not different works of art in human history, but rather that all of the history of human art is just one giant collective piece of art, and each new artist is just adding to that one piece of art. Inspired by those who came before him, he is sort of continuing their work. Like Virgil was inspired by Homer, sort of continuing his work of the Odyssey. Like Beethoven was inspired by Haydn, sort of continuing his music, sort of adding to his pieces of music, because Haydn's pieces of music made Beethoven produce new compositions in his mind and then also in actuality. Kant at some point says about this, since the spirit is directed towards the universal, it is, so to say, divine particula aurea, and drawn from the universal spirit. Therefore, the spirit doesn't have specific attributes. Rather, according to the different talents and sensitivities which it meets, it vivifies differently. And, since those are so manifold, every spirit has something individual to it. One ought not to say the geniuses. It is the unity of the world soul. But even if Kant himself only talks about how the genius through his products inspires other geniuses, I would insist that even the non-genius viewer of a piece of art, if he is touched by that artwork at all, if he has any receptivity at all for art, even he is, even if maybe to a lesser degree, inspired by it. And even if his inspiration may not result in him actually producing a piece of art that others could view, at least it makes him produce, even if just for a moment, even if just while viewing that artwork, it makes him produce something in himself. At least in himself, inside of himself, he too, like the genius would, continues creating that artwork, right? When you listen to certain music, you have certain feelings, you have certain thoughts going on inside your head. So you are sort of adding to that music inside your head, even if you cannot put it into words. Or likewise, when you are watching a certain painting, it might stir up something inside of you. Again, certain feelings or certain further images that are not in the painting itself, but that are sort of inspired by that painting. So I would say that the true work of art sort of inspires us to get us into a similar artistic mood. The power, the productive, the even creative power of imagination of the artist produces something that gives life to our own free and creative power of imagination. Now, what the artist's power of imagination produces, so that thing which goes beyond the root that is the intellect's concepts, that thing which makes up the crown of the tree, Kant calls it aesthetical ideas. And it is so important to him in what makes genius that he goes so far at some point to call the genius in general the faculty of having or producing aesthetical ideas. Now, what are those aesthetical ideas? I already talked about what idea means to Kant in my lecture on what is reason, because usually he says that reason is the faculty of ideas. But reason, to be more precise, is just the faculty of intellectual ideas. And here now we are talking about aesthetical ideas. Well, you could say that in the most general sense, the word idea to Kant means a representation that can never lead to cognition. So, to us gaining actual new knowledge and understanding. Because, as he shows in his critique of pure reason, cognition always has two parts for us as human beings, a discursive and an intuitive part. Concept and viewing. And it needs those two halves. One half is not enough to have a cognition. As the famous quote of Kant goes, he would say that viewing without concepts is blind, meaning you don't know what it is you're viewing. While on the other hand, thoughts, that is concepts, without viewing are empty, meaning you are thinking something, but you don't really know if that something you're thinking is really a thing or if it is really nothing. So you need both. You need the combination of viewing and thinking. You need to have a concept of what it is you are viewing. You need to understand it. But you also need to have viewing that fills your concept. It's not enough to just understand what something is, because that something could also be non-existent. Like I can understand what magic is, but I cannot view magic because it doesn't exist. Well, Kant would say that it is possible, normally, to have only viewing, or to have only a concept, which again are not enough for cognition, but to eventually, at least potentially, add that other half. Right? So I could view something that I don't have a concept of, but could later find a concept for it. An example I used in previous lectures would be the archaeologist digging up some object that past humans have created. So now he is viewing, he's holding this thing in his hand, and maybe he's seeing it very clearly, but he doesn't know what he is seeing. He doesn't yet know, was this used as a tool, was this used for ritual purposes. He doesn't have a concept of it yet. But this object which he is viewing here, he could find a concept for it. He could come to understand what it is, and then he would have a cognition. On the other hand, we have some concepts that we lack a viewing of, like our concept of aliens. We are thinking of something here that is of living and even intelligent beings that live on other planets, but we don't have any viewing of them filling that concept. But at least potentially, we could. If there are aliens out there somewhere, then it is potentially possible for us to find out, to have cognition about them. Well, again, an idea would now be a representation that is only one half, so that is only viewing or only concept, but to which the other half cannot possibly be given. So mostly when Kant talks about ideas, he means intellectual ideas. So the ideas that reason produces. And again, I discussed those in the lecture on what is reason. And those intellectual ideas, they are concepts to which no viewing can be given. That is because they are concepts expressing a totality, expressing something absolute, like the concept of the good, the concept of wisdom, the concept of freedom, the concept of God. Everything that we view is limited, is conditioned. And that means a concept of a totality, there can never be given a proper viewing to it. Even if we do have free will, we can never view our freedom. All we can view is that now we did this thing. For example, now I decided to sit here and to not stand up. And if I were to stand up, then I would view me standing up and not sitting there. But I can never view the fact that I could also have done the other thing. I can think that, but I have no viewing of it. I mean, it's not like I can go back in time and try out if I really could have done the opposite thing. So freedom is something we can think but not view, even if we are free. And likewise God, right? We can think of God, we can understand what we mean by God, we can think of God as this almighty, all-knowing being and so on. But even if there is a God, we cannot possibly view him. Precisely because he is the allness, he is almighty, all-knowing. That goes completely beyond what we could possibly view. We could only ever see that someone has a certain power, that someone has certain knowledge, but even if he was all-powerful or all knowledgeable, we could never actually experience that. So that's intellectual ideas. Thoughts for which there cannot be a corresponding viewing. And again, usually when he says idea without any adjective, he means those intellectual ideas. But the aesthetical idea is the direct opposite of the intellectual idea. It is essential representation. So something we don't think, but rather something we are in a way affected by. It is essential representation to which there cannot be a corresponding concept. No concept could be enough for this central image. No concept is enough to grasp it and for us to understand that. The image sort of will always go beyond all the concepts we could have of it. So I will stress once again that it is very important to Kant that the power of imagination in the genius should go beyond the concepts of its intellect, but it should never contradict them and be in outright opposition to them. Because that would then mean what Kant calls Schwärmerei, that is enthusiasm or mysticism. That's exactly his criticism of it. That it makes up central images that are in direct opposition to our concepts. And so when people claim to have certain visions, when people claim to be speaking to the spirits or to God or whatever, then it seems that they have central representations. They are seeing images, hearing voices, but those don't just go beyond our concepts of the laws of nature. They seem to contradict them. And I think the same would be true for madness. As I already said in the last lecture, there is, in how Kant describes genius, there is a certain relation between genius and madness. Both are original. Both produce something that doesn't just imitate or that doesn't just follow rules. But I would say what differentiates them is that both their power of imagination goes beyond their concepts, but in the genius, it goes beyond them without contradicting them, while in the madman, it completely contradicts them. If we keep using Kant's image, Kant's allegory of the tree, and if we continue it, then maybe we could say that in the genius, just like in the enthusiast or in the madman, the power of imagination creates the crown of the tree, creates all the branches and leaves that grow far beyond the reach of the mere roots. But in the genius, the roots in the ground, so the intellect with its concepts, the roots are strong, and therefore the tree is standing strong. While you could maybe say that both the enthusiast and the madman, their trees lack strong roots. The first maybe lacks strong roots because he has never built them, like his roots never grow. He never really cultivated his intellect. He never really formed proper concepts, a proper understanding of the world, but just let his power of imagination sprawl, just let the branches grow in all sorts of directions. While the latter, the madman, here you could say maybe he once had roots, but maybe some worms, some termites or whatever came along and gnawed at his roots, making the roots weak. But the result is the same for both of them, Kant would say. The result is that the tree could very easily fall down. A small gush of wind could maybe make the tree fall over, and maybe even its own growth. The fact that its branches are sprawling in all directions while it's not held by strong roots, maybe even its own growth will make the tree fall down. While in the genius, the intellect with its concepts is always the basis, is always making up the roots. But anyways, so the main reason for Kant to call aesthetical ideas is because, like the intellectual ideas, they are representations that can never sort of be given their other half, and therefore that can never lead to a cognition. Kant says there's also a second, so lesser justification for calling the aesthetical ideas, and that is because while they are sensual representations, so they are viewable, they are not thoughts, they still seem in a way to strive beyond sensuality, beyond what can be viewed, towards the realm of the supersensual. And the actual ideas, the intellectual ideas, they are precisely that, right? They are concepts of the supersensual, like God, like freedom, like the soul. They are concepts of things that go beyond the sensual realm, beyond nature. So you could maybe say that the intellectual ideas, as ideas, are concepts to which no viewing can ever be given, and therefore concepts which cannot lead to cognition. But of all unfitting viewings that could be given to them, of all unfitting image, so to say, that could illustrate them, the aesthetical ideas are the ones which still fit best. If a viewing could ever be given to the intellectual ideas, it would be that which is the aesthetical idea. Maybe that's not so easy to understand, so let me explain with an example. Take the intellectual idea of the necessary end of all material things, and of the vanity of all material things. This clearly is an intellectual idea, meaning it is something you can think, but you can never view. There can never be given a proper viewing for it. Why not? Because you can only view the destruction of certain material things, right? You can view the destruction of a house, you can view the death of a person, but you cannot possibly view the destruction of all material things, because then you would have to view the destruction of the whole universe, and how would you view that? You yourself are part of the universe. And even then, even if you could view that, you still wouldn't be viewing the necessary destruction of all things, right? You still wouldn't have a viewing of the fact that the universe is being destructed because its material nature demands it, because no material thing can ever be endless and limitless, because only the supersensual can be limitless. You cannot view that because necessity is something that cannot be viewed. It's something that can only be thought. You could only view that a thing is being destroyed, but you cannot view the fact that it must eventually be destroyed, that its end was inevitable. So this idea of the vanity of all things, of everything material, even the grandest things eventually coming to an end, is something to which no viewing can be given. But if a viewing could be given to it, if you could somehow illustrate that idea, if you could give an image that lets people not just think but see that idea, then I don't know any better way to do that than through the poem Ozymandias, which goes, I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Again, this central image is not really the right viewing for that idea of the necessary vanity of all material things. I mean, if you really think about it, the poem only talks about the vanity of the might of a king, not of all material things. And even here, it doesn't really prove that this is necessary. Like you could say, okay, this particular king, he was wrong in thinking that his might would last forever, but maybe another king, maybe another empire could last forever. So if you really try to intellectualize it, you would still find that this viewing falls short of the intellectual idea. But still, this aesthetical idea, it stirs up our senses. It makes us imagine further things. We read only about this one particular king and his demise, but we think, we sort of feel that everything comes to an end, that everything that people may feel proud of or that may make them feel mighty is really nothing and will turn to dust. And that is, again, that is a secondary reason why Kant feels justified in calling these representations that he's talking about aesthetical ideas, because while they are sensual, that is what aesthetical means to Kant, like the intellectual ideas, they seem to go beyond the mere sensuality. They seem to go for something higher. But with that, let us turn to the third and maybe in a way most important component of the genius. And that is what Kant called spirit. Because, well, intellect alone, having concepts alone, is not enough to be a great artist. With that, you could maybe be a scientist. You could maybe write a treatise on your topic, but it would not be a work of art. Well, on the other hand, having a very vivid, a very creative, productive power of imagination, having very strong aesthetical ideas, that also isn't enough to be an artist, Kant would say, because those aesthetical ideas, they are just inside of you. They are just sort of your own feelings, your own inner images. If you cannot communicate them to others, if you cannot put them into words or into music or into images, you are not an artist. You are maybe someone who can appreciate the artworks of others very much, but you yourself are not an artist. And also the last component of the genius, taste, which I will address later, also is not enough to make you an artist. No, what is needed, Kant says, to communicate your aesthetical ideas to others is spirit. A work of art needs to be a work of spirit. I will note here that I find it a bit unfortunate that you cannot rightly translate this into English. Like what Kant is saying here in English sounds a bit more unusual than it does in German, because in German he says the third component, that which in the tree of genius, so to say, makes up the fruit, is Geist. And yes, Geist can be translated as spirit. Could also be translated as ghost. Etymologically, it has the same root as the English word ghost. But in German, there is no difference between spirit and ghost. English has these two words because it has ghost, which has Germanic roots, and then it has spirit, which has Latin roots from spiritus. But in German, we just have Geist. But the thing is that in German, you can use this word Geist to denote a sort of inner quality and depth, both of a work of art and also of a person. Like you can say, this poem has Geist, so it has spirit. Or you could say, this conversation has Geist, or we also say geistreich, which literally means spirit rich. So we can say, das ist ein geistreiches Gespräch. This is a spirit rich conversation, meaning this is a conversation that has actual depth. This is a conversation that actually gives me something. While the opposite of that would be geistlos, which literally means spiritless. So I could say this is a spiritless conversation, meaning it's very trivial. It doesn't really give anything to me. We can also say that for persons. I could say this is a very geistreiche Person, so a very spirit-rich person, meaning a person that maybe has many ideas, that a person that I like talking to, because I always come back from these conversations with new thoughts, with new ideas, having learned new things. And on the other hand, I could say this is eine geistlose Person. This is a spiritless person. A person, well, talking to is kind of useless because he has nothing of interest, nothing of depth to say. Maybe this latter word, geistlos, could be translated to English best as mindless. That sort of means the same, right? Like when I say this is a very mindless person. So I feel like the word mindless doesn't have such a wide application. Like I could call a person mindless, but maybe it sounds a bit weird when I say this work of art is mindless. While in German, I could say it is geistlos. But in English, there's no real positive opposite for mindless, right? Like I cannot say this person is not mindless, he's mind rich, or he's mindful. I mean, the word mindful exists, but it means something else, right? It means being sort of careful, thinking about others or whatever. So what I'm trying to say here is that while spirit is a correct translation for Geist, it just sounds more unusual in English to say a person has spirit or a work of art has spirit, while when Kant says that in German, any German speaker immediately has a sense of what Kant is talking about. Maybe there are some other languages than English into which this particular part of Kant's philosophy could be translated more easily. Like take French. In French, you have the word esprit, which is the same word as spirit, basically. So it has the same Latin root from spiritus. But it is used in a slightly different way that is closer to the German Geist. So in French, you can talk about a person having esprit, or a conversation or work of art having esprit. To Kant, this third component of the genius is particularly important. So important that he suggests that we could translate the word genius, or in German Genie, which the German language in the 18th century took from the French language. He suggests that it could be translated to German as eigentümlicher Geist, which means something like peculiar spirit or individual spirit. And after all, the word genius basically does mean spirit, right? It comes from Latin genius, and the genius is a sort of spirit. So what does Kant mean by spirit, and why is it such an important component of genius? Well, Kant here does something he often does when analyzing a concept. And I already talked about that in previous lectures. I already talked about that in my lectures explaining what philosophy is to Kant, what metaphysics, what wisdom is to Kant. He tries not to give completely new and arbitrary meanings to a word. Like, what justification would the philosopher have to pick up a word which already exists and which already is used in a certain way and just randomly say, I don't care how the word is used, I decide to now use it in this way? No, Kant would say that the job of philosophy is to analyze and to not teach us something entirely new, to not make up entirely new thoughts. Only empirical sciences can teach us entirely new things, like the biologist can discover a new species, the astronomer can discover a new star that hasn't been known before. But the philosopher, since he is only dealing with our own thinking, is not supposed to come up with new things. He is supposed to bring more clarity into that which, at least vaguely, at least unconsciously, we already do know. So what Kant does is, and what he is quite masterful at, is analyzing words and concepts that are already in use and just helping us become more clear about how we use them, what we mean by them. Well, Kant defines the spirit as the stimulating or even the vivifying principle in a thing. And if you think about it, that is what we mean by spirit, right? So people who believe that we are not just a heap of cells, that we are not just our material bodies, but that we have a spirit, what is it they believe? They believe that it is this thing which they call spirit, which gives life to this material body, right? That without the spirit, and the moment the spirit leaves the body, it is just a clump of cells, just dead matter and nothing else. And likewise, take the word inspiration, which literally means a spirit coming into us, right? What do we mean when we say someone is inspired? We mean that in a way, new life is given to him, right? In a way, he was vivified. There's a new vivifying principle in him, making him act, making him produce something, making him produce art. In German, we even have the expression den Geist aufgeben, which literally means giving up your spirit. And that's an euphemism for dying, basically. I can say someone has given up his spirit, meaning he is dead. And actually in German, this can even be used for non-living objects. Like I can say my car or my phone has given up its spirit. and that means it broke down. It doesn't function anymore. So by spirit, we seem to mean that in a thing which gives that thing life, so to say. And that is exactly why, if the work of genius is a tree, Kant identifies the spirit with the fruit of the tree. Because, to be sure, the intellect, representing the roots, and the power of imagination, representing the treetop, they are enough to make up a tree. But such a tree could not give anything to me. If I pass by a tree which has no fruit, it's just a tree. I will walk on. This tree doesn't have anything to offer to me. And again, there's a fourth component which I will come to later, that is taste. Taste making up the blossoms of the tree. So taste being that which makes the work of art beautiful. Well, if the tree doesn't just have roots and a crown, but also has beautiful blossoms, then I may stop in my tracks for a moment and look at the tree, and I may like what I see. But ultimately, still, this doesn't give me anything. I'm not benefiting from it. In the end, I will continue in my tracks. I will walk on, and while for a moment I will have enjoyed looking at the beautiful blossoms of the tree, if the tree has no fruits I can eat, I will take nothing away from it. And likewise, Kant would say, there are works of art, or there are conversations, or there are even people who may be nice, who may be agreeable. So I may enjoy this poem or this piece of music for a while, or I may enjoy talking to this person and joking around with that person for a while. But ultimately, Kant says they are geistlos, spiritless, meaning I don't take anything away from them. They don't give me anything. But a real work of art should cultivate me. I should not just view it for a moment and enjoy viewing it for a moment and then forget about it because it was just a fleeting pleasure, but rather it should transform me. It should really touch me and turn me into another person. It should really enrich me. Just like a tree which has fruits that I can pluck and that I can eat. And that fruit of the tree, that is the spirit in the genius. So, like the fruit contains a seed for a new tree, it is the spirit in the genius which can inspire me when I view a work of art, which can inspire me to follow that other genius, if I myself am a genius, which can plant a seed in me to myself produce a genius work of art. Now, if you ask which element is it in a beautiful work of art that vivifies the viewer, then Kant would say it is the aesthetical ideas, which I already talked about. Precisely because they are sensual representations which can never be grasped by the intellect with its concepts, which can never be fully understood. And that means the aesthetical ideas give my intellect matter, they give content to my intellect, which the intellect, as a faculty of forms, of form giving, can, so to say, try to process, but it will never be done processing it. The aesthetical idea will always give new matter to it. So the intellect can possess the aesthetical idea because it is not a sensual representation that is just nonsense. That would be if it was the ravings of a madman. But a proper aesthetical idea is something my intellect can make sense of, but it will never be done making sense of it. No matter how well I understand a piece of art, it will always go beyond my understanding, right? So that is why we can always keep interpreting works of art. And why there can be such a thing as a correct interpretation, so an interpretation that works, but there can never be such a thing as an exhaustive interpretation, right? So if you have a great piece of art, you could write one essay interpreting it, but no matter how extensive that essay is, no matter how thorough you are, you could also write a second, completely different essay with a completely new interpretation that would work just as well. So the great work of art always has more to offer. More than a single interpreter, more than also the artist himself when he was creating his artwork, when he was thinking with his intellect about what he wanted to do, more than any human being can ever think. It does give us something to think, it does give us material, so to say, to process with our intellect, but that processing can never be done. And that is exactly why it is so vivifying for us, why we enjoy that work of art, Kant would say, because it gives our intellect endless work. A good poem, a good play, a good book, I can read again and again, or a good movie I can watch again and again, and each time I will find new details. Each time it will give me new food for thought. Each time I will come back with new insights, let's say, into human nature. Or each time it will give me new inspiration to create a work of art of my own. And in that way, it is the aesthetical idea which vivifies. However, here you might be a little confused, because I just said that to Kant, in the genius, the component which is vivifying to the viewer of the artwork is the spirit. But I previously said that it is the power of imagination which produces aesthetical ideas. And now I am saying that the aesthetical ideas are vivifying. So is it the spirit, or is it the power of imagination which vivifies? And indeed, I find Kant to be a little unclear here in the critique of the power of judgment. Like, you really have to read it twice or thrice and really read in detail to understand what he means. But basically, what Kant means is the power of imagination produces the aesthetical ideas. So the spirit is not the faculty of producing or of having aesthetical ideas, but it is the faculty of being able to depict aesthetical ideas, and therefore of being able to communicate your aesthetical ideas to others. And therefore it is the spirit which helps vivifying others. Even though the material which it uses to vivify the aesthetical idea does not come from the spirit itself, but comes from the power of imagination. So basically what Kant means is that the aesthetical idea as such is only sensual. It is not intellectual at all. So it really is not something you can think. It is only something you can feel. It is sort of a feeling, a sensation, a mood you are in. Not something that could usually be expressed in words. And that is precisely the reason why it is just subjective, why you can usually not communicate it to others. Having an aesthetical idea means you are watching something. Let's say you are watching a piece of art, you are watching a movie or a painting, or you're listening to music. Or maybe something in nature, you're watching the sunset or a dark forest or whatever, and this gives you a certain inner feeling. This brings you into a certain mood, and that mood is your aesthetical idea. Any person, including the non-genius, could maybe have this, but the regular person, the non-genius, cannot communicate it to others. Genius to Kant, or more specifically now this third component of genius, the spirit, genius means the talent of finding a fitting depiction for your aesthetical ideas that allows you to communicate them to others, and that sort of creates the same aesthetical idea that you had in others. So the genius, through his spirit, is able to take what otherwise would just be a fleeting feeling, a fleeting mood, and put it into an image, put it into words, put it into the right melody or whatever, and thereby express it. Which is why Kant says the artist who is not a genius, the artist who is just an imitator, Kant calls him the painter of nature, while the true artist, the genius, Kant calls the painter of ideas. So by painter here, Kant doesn't mean necessarily the actual painter, rather he means painter in a broader sense. So he would say that the poet paints with words and the composer paints with music. But the point is, the imitator, with his words, with his music, or with his actual painting, just paints nature. So he just paints what he sees, and what anyone can see. So he just imitates, he just copies those regular central images, while the actual genius paints ideas. He is able, so some wonderful miracle, to paint, to depict that which cannot be painted, which goes beyond all painting usually. And this is exactly the part of genius which Kant calls a talent. That is a natural gift. I talked about this in the previous lecture on the genius. This spirit, this ability of depicting your aesthetical ideas and expressing them to others, that is the part that cannot be learned, that is not following a conscious rule, that the genius himself cannot explain, not even to himself, but that is just sort of a lucky gift of nature you have, a lucky inspiration. It just comes over you. You have one moment, you have this aesthetical idea, your productive power of imagination is creating this mood, this feeling inside of you, and then suddenly you got it. You know how to express it. That is what the spirit does in the genius. This spirit-rich, geistreich depiction will always contain more than the mere intellect can think. Sometimes it can be a single word, like for example in Romanticism, in the poetry of Romanticism, the German Romantic poets, around the time of the end of Kant's life, so he didn't really take note of them anymore. One of their favorite words was Waldeinsamkeit, which literally means forest loneliness. And this is a word that you often have in these poems, and that contains so much that it is not possible to describe it to you. But the important thing is that it contains more than the mere concept. Waldeinsamkeit, sure, literally it just means being alone in the woods, right? But it contains more than that. It contains a certain feeling that the Romantic poems are expressing in that way. Or likewise, if you have a work like Miyazaki's Nausicaa, the movie, and even more so the manga, sure, it contains certain ideas about life, and life always going on, and always finding a way, being stronger than death. It contains certain ideas about humans, human greed, human hubris, human lust for power, human folly, the delusions leading humans to war and to self-destruction. Um, but it contains so much more than that. Anyone who knows the movie, and more so the manga, will know how trivial this short description is, how little justice it does to this story. Because the story always lets us think so much more than even the greatest description could ever come close to describing. And sure, Miyazaki could have just written an essay on these topics. He could have given a speech on these topics. But that, since it would have been just about concepts, could not possibly have included quite as much as we can think and feel when watching or reading his work. And that is the important thing when it comes to spirit, as Kant describes it. It always contains a more than our intellect can grasp. It always gives us new matter to deal with. For example, one famous romantic poem in German is by the poet Josef von Eichendorff. It's called Mondnacht, Moon Night. I already mentioned it in a previous lecture. And it starts with saying, es war, als hätt der Himmel die Erde still geküsst, dass sie im Blütenschimmer von ihm nun träumen müsst. And to give a literal translation, which of course won't sound as good because it won't rhyme and so on, but literally it means it was as if the sky or the heaven had quietly kissed the earth, so that now she had to dream of him in the shimmer of blossoms. That is something that you couldn't put into mere concepts. Like, I could try to describe an evening, a certain evening, and how the light was that evening, how the temperature was, and so on. But that could not come close to this genius image that Eichendorff is using of the sky quietly kissing the earth, so that now in the shimmer of blossoms she has to dream of him. When we hear that, it does something to us. It puts us into a certain mood. It lets us feel, and also in a way think more than we could ever put into words, than concepts could ever grasp. And this is not true just for poems, this is true for all works of art. Whether it is music, like Beethoven's Für Elise, whether it is paintings, like think of the famous painting of Caspar David Friedrich of the Wanderer standing on the mountaintop and looking down on the landscape, on the clouds in front of him. This is true for movies, like think of Spirited Away and that scene where Chihiro and the No-Face board the train and quietly drive in the train through the flooded land. Again and again, the genius art gives you something which will put you in a certain mood, which will vivify you, which will steer up your own aesthetical ideas and give your intellect something to think about without ever being done with it. I already said in the lecture on what is beauty that when it comes to the beautiful, unlike in the process of experience and cognition, the intellect is not sort of subjugating the thing which we are viewing, slapping its label on it, understanding it through its concepts, saying, you are dead, and now I'm done with you, now I know what you are. But rather, I said that when it comes to beauty, there is a free playing going on between our intellect and our power of imagination, which sort of play with one another and never are done with one another when we are watching a beautiful thing, as Kant says. Well, that, which I already explained in that earlier lecture, that is very much true, not just for beauty in general, but also very much for the beautiful work of art. And with these three components, you already basically have genius. So the genius needs intellect for the roots, for having a certain concept. He needs the productive, the creative even, power of imagination for the treetop. And in order for the tree to give us fruits, to give us something to eat, to strengthen us, to give us new life force, in order for the tree to have seeds for new trees, we need spirit, which allows us, if we are a genius, to express our aesthetical ideas, to depict them. Kant says in the end, genius is about a lucky harmony between the intellect and the power of imagination, with the power of imagination producing ideas that correspond to the concepts of the intellect, but go far beyond the concepts of the intellect. And genius is about that lucky ability that cannot be explained, that cannot be learned or studied or grasped by a science. That lucky ability, that spirit, that allows us to express our aesthetical ideas, to find a fitting depiction for them. These three together basically already make up the genius. Yet still, to Kant, there is a fourth component, and that, as I already said, is taste, providing the tree with its beautiful blossoms. As a side note, Kant says at some point in his lectures on anthropology that in mythology there expresses itself the genius of the peoples, of whole nations. What he means by that maybe won't be understood as easily today as it was in the 18th century, because the shallowness and the egocentrism of our age make it so that most people, let's say, are mythologically illiterate. And this shows very much in how we deal with mainly the Greek and the Nordic myths. That is, we are treating them more or less like some streaming service show on Netflix or on Amazon. There are, I would say, there are two basic errors that people are making. The first is that people think there is such a thing as a canon, right? People nowadays are very much obsessed with canon, discussing what is canon, like what is the Star Wars canon or whatever, meaning what is true, what is correct, what really happened, and what isn't. Well, the simple answer is nothing really happened. It's a made-up story. There is no Force, there are no Jedi. And the same is true for mythology. So this leads people to these wrong judgments, thinking that, for example, Zeus constantly is cheating on Hera, and Hera constantly is trying to kill his bastard children, because people take all these individual myths of Zeus having a child with this woman, or having a child with this woman, and they put them together into one complete canon where all of this happened together. I think this is probably influenced by the book-based cults that ended up replacing the older expressions of religion. So in our case, in the case of the West, mostly Christianity. Because here you do have a sort of canon. You have this one holy book, and what's in that book, that is the truth, so to say. That is what happened, and other things, they didn't happen, so to say. They are not canon. But that's not necessarily how ancient people dealt with their mythologies. They had a more free way of dealing with it, of always reinventing it and recreating it and adding to it something that is sort of lost once you put it into a book and say, this is the holy book, this is how it went down. And then second, people make the mistake of, in a very naive way, taking these myths at face value, as if this is how it really happened, or at least what people like the ancient Greeks believed really happened. So people basically fail to understand myths as myth, as opposed to as supposed history. And this, again, may be very much influenced by the more recent ways of dealing with religion, because especially the fundamentalists want their holy books to be understood as not mythology but history. So they will claim this, understood quite naively, literally at face value, this is how it really went down. And this misunderstanding, this taking the myths at face value that happens so often nowadays, this leads people to, in a very trivial way, psychologize the mythological figures, even the gods, and also to moralize about them, to say things like, oh, Zeus is an asshole, he's always cheating, and all the gods are assholes, maybe even Athena is an asshole. Look how she treated Medusa, how she cursed Medusa for basically being raped by Poseidon. But that's not how you read a myth. The gods are not assholes, because they are not human beings, just mightier human beings, superhuman beings with powers that act in these ways, that you can judge morally. Rather, the myths are depicting ideas. You must not treat them as if this was some telenovela with a cast of characters constantly scrabbling and cheating on each other and having all sorts of stupid conflicts. That is not what a myth is. Well, when Kant talks about the mythology of a people being an expression of that people's genius, then I think the only proper way to understand it is by understanding it through Kant's concept of the genius and its components. So he means that, first of all, the mythology expresses the concepts of a people. It expresses how a people understands the world, what concepts it has of the world it inhabits. But in this early stage, with no developed science yet, those concepts are not expressed merely as concepts, but rather they are expressed in images. That is, if you look at the Greeks, that is like the difference between Hesiod and Thales. there is this development that took place, which nowadays gets called often the development from mythos to logos. And the mythos is at the start of that development. So the concepts a people has of the world are not yet expressed as mere concepts in clear scientific terms. They are expressed in images. And secondly, Kant would say the myth include aesthetical ideas. So they don't just include how a people understands the world, but sort of what a people feels along with these concepts. What feelings, what moods those concepts put the people into. And then, third, Kant would probably say the myth expresses the spirit of a people. So the depictions, the expressions a people finds to express that concepts it has, along with the aesthetical ideas, along with the feelings and moods those concepts sort of start in their hearts, those depictions they find show the spirit a people has. So think of the Greek myth that depicts wisdom, that is Athena, coming into the world fully armed and armored, and as an adult, not as a child, springing forth, not being born from a woman, but springing forth from the head, from the mind of the highest God, of the ruler of the world, of the God of justice. Or think of the Nordic myth, where you have wisdom, where you have Odin, sacrificing one sensual eye to gain the higher eye, to gain foresight. Or take the Babylonian myth, where war and love, passion, are one. That is the goddess Ishtar or Inanna, and where she goes into the underworld, and even she, when going into the underworld, step by step has to get rid of all her majesty, of all her signs of power, gets humbled and humiliated. Or think of the Indian myth, where the whole world, including all the gods, no matter how countless gods there are, no matter how many thousands and tens of thousands of years this world lasts, all of it is just a dream of the one highest God. And all of it will be gone when he wakes from his dream. And then in another night, he will have another dream with another world, with countless gods and countless ages and so on. And there already have been myriads of worlds, and there will be myriads of worlds. These things, they let us grasp the spirit of a people, we could say with Kant. And like with a work of art, you are never done interpreting a myth. A myth always offers you new food for thought. Just think of what Nietzsche did with the Greek myth, with the myths of Dionysus, how much he had to think and to say about it. And lastly, there is always the fourth component. There is always taste. So there is the form that the genius gives to whatever he depicts, the form he gives to the spirit. And in this, Kant would probably say the Greeks stood out as the most tasteful people. He would probably say that the mythologies of other people, of other cultures, are more rough, more grotesque. They may depict true insights, they may have correct concepts of the world, and they may even have spirit. That is, they may even find very good depictions, very vivifying depictions, expressions of their concepts, of their aesthetical ideas that make us think a lot, but he would probably say that they are not quite as tasteful. They don't have quite the same beautiful form. And that leads me to that fourth and last component of the genius, that is taste. Taste which to the tree adds the beautiful blossom adorning the tree. Because Kant would say that in a way the first three components I talked about, the intellect with its concept, the power of imagination with its aesthetical ideas, and the spirit allowing us to find the right expression of that ideas, they already make up the genius. But someone who had only those three without taste would produce ingenious art, but not truly beautiful art. To Kant, there are examples for that. In ancient times, he believes that Homer was more of a rough genius, very much a genius, but not quite as tasteful and therefore not as much liked by Kant as Virgil. In more modern times, he, along with Hume, believes that particularly the English nation does have good concepts, they do have power of imagination, and they very much have spirit. So they have lots of genius ideas, he would say, but they lack the taste that the French have. And to him, Shakespeare is an example of an author that has a lot of genius, but is not quite as tasteful. Genius without taste would produce art that is sort of rough around the edges, or that can even be grotesque. Art that isn't quite tasteful always, that isn't always quite harmonious. So as a composer, he might produce genius sounds, but it might lack certain harmony between the parts, certain rhythm. Or as a writer, he might have genius ideas and some very ingenious expressions, but there might be some elements in his writing that don't quite fit together. Remember, I talked about taste in its own lecture already. Remember that to Kant, taste means the ability of our aesthetical power of judgment to find that which is universally liked. So, which is liked not just by me, but by others. And this is clearly, he says, what an artist should possess. Because spirit in the genius is only the ability to express your aesthetical ideas that vivify the viewer. So if you are a genius with spirit, you can communicate your aesthetical ideas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can also communicate the pleasure they give you. Giving a work a form that gives pleasure not just to your own private sense as the artist, but that speaks to the common sense of all people, that would require taste. Otherwise, the artwork could be vivifying to the viewer. It could vivify his faculties of mind, but still without really being liked by him, without really giving him a lasting pleasure. It could still, while vivifying him, give him some displeasure. It could maybe vivify his faculties of mind in a disharmonious way, vivifying one faculty too much, one too little. So Kant would say that the artist should close his genius, close his ideas in a tasteful form. He does say that the genius has the right to sometimes break with the rules of good taste and to sometimes sort of break out of that form if it's too restrictive. That is sort of a certain privilege the genius has, because the mere imitator, Kant says, does not have that privilege. He should always be mindful to stay within the beautiful forms. But the genius, well, sometimes his ideas, sometimes his spirit may call for an expression that goes beyond the beautiful form, that cannot be expressed within the confines of that form. And then that is okay. But it should not be overdone, Kant believes. Otherwise, the artwork, well, will be very geistreich, very spirit-rich, but not really bring pleasure to the viewer. And Kant even goes so far as to saying that at the end of the day, it's better to cut down the spirit a little than cutting down the taste. Because a work of art that is not so rich in spirit, that is not so ingenious, when it is tasteful in its form, can still be liked. It can still bring pleasure to us. Maybe it will not cultivate us so much. Maybe it will be a bit more trivial as a work of art, not as deep. But it can still entertain us and bring us pleasure. While on the other hand, uncontrolled genius, not restricted by taste, doesn't bring so much pleasure, isn't liked, and then the genius itself is also sort of lost, because no one will like to look at that artwork. So Kant would always suggest that when they get into conflict with one another, better tone it down on your genius a little than toning it down on your taste. This makes me think of the often expressed thought that children, even small children, they are geniuses. Like, you have some people who will say that all children are geniuses. They are all artistic geniuses. And there's even this one famous NASA study done by Land, who claims that he has found that like 98% of little children are geniuses. I think with Kant and with his concept of the genius, we can understand and also judge this opinion better, judge the merit of this opinion. I would say that children indeed can possess quite a lot of, let's say, positive genius. That is the first three qualities. The actual spirit of genius, but not so much negative genius. That is the taste restricting the genius. Because for positive genius, what you need, sure, is intellect. So the newborn baby doesn't have a developed intellect yet. It doesn't have concepts yet. It doesn't have an understanding of the world yet. But the intellect starts developing quite early. And basically, as soon as the child can talk, it has concepts. It has an understanding of the world. So as soon as the intellect is there, it can conceptualize things. And certainly the child has a productive power of imagination and is capable of having aesthetical ideas that go beyond its concepts. And as for the spirit, well, the spirit is not tied to age, right? Because it is not something learned, something acquired, but it is a talent. It is a gift of nature, Kant says. So sure, little kids already can have spirit. And we find that in the products, in the artistic products of children, whether they are painting an image, whether they are drawing something, or whether they make up some story and they're playing, imagining some scenario that they are playing out. This can sometimes be quite geistreich, quite spirit-rich. So children can find quite fitting, quite wonderful, and quite original expressions and depictions for their aesthetical ideas. But what their products, their drawings, or their stories they tell, what they are usually not is being quite tasteful in their form. They usually have elements that are a little overdone, that don't quite fit to each other, that are not as harmonious. And that also makes sense within Kant's philosophy, if you think about it. Because if you watched my lectures on taste and on the power of judgment, I said that taste is a form of the power of judgment. It is the aesthetical power of judgment to Kant. And as for the power of judgment, Kant says that it develops later in life than the intellect. He says that little children don't have power of judgment yet, at least not a good one, not a trained one, but rather we have to train it in the course of our lives. And it cannot just be taught to us, because it's not like the intellect just following a rule, but rather we can only train it through using it, through again and again making judgments and thereby learning how to judge, and through examples. So Kant would say that the taste, and I talked about that in the lecture on taste, the taste can best be trained and cultivated through being surrounded by examples of good taste, through coming in contact with classical works of art that stood the test of time and that show me what a tasteful artwork, so what something that is liked by everyone looks like. And again, taste is something that the products of children don't yet have necessarily. So they are often not beautiful. They often don't have a form that will be universally liked, but rather they have a form that makes them only liked by the artist himself, by the child. And maybe also by the parents, but even they are probably just saying, oh, that's such a beautiful picture, because they want to be nice to their child and not because it really fits with their taste. So taste is the one thing that the infant genius does not yet have. But the other three components of genius can very much be there in children already. And I think from that, you can also conclude how you should raise and educate a child when it comes to aesthetics, when you want the child to be able to be a genius artist. That is, you should try to improve and to develop the child's taste, again, by giving the child good examples. But on the other hand, you should leave the genius of the child, which is already there and which couldn't be taught anyways because it is a gift of nature, you should leave the genius alone. As I said in the last lecture on genius, Kant says that giving too many rules to genius, restricting particularly the spirit in the genius, restricting that too much, kills off the genius. And I think, unfortunately, if we look at how children are raised now, we are doing the exact opposite. That is, we are not refining the children's taste. We are not helping them develop and cultivate their taste through classical works of art. But on the other hand, we are giving them so many rules. We are telling them what to do and what not to do, that it restricts their genius. And that leads to, as that famous NASA study found, despite the fact that basically all children possess genius, most adults, most grown-ups not possessing genius. Quite the contrary, being blind to genius. And I don't know a better depiction of that fact. A depiction, I might add, that in itself is a quite ingenious depiction, a quite spirit-rich depiction, than the one in The Little Prince, where the child draws a picture of a snake having swallowed an elephant. A quite spiritful picture, you could say. And yet the narrow-minded adults, whose genius has already died, are not able to see anything but merely the picture of a head. But coming back to Kant, to him, the taste doesn't really add to the genius per se. It has a more of negative function, restricting the genius, so that the genius only expresses itself within the bounds of what is tasteful, what is beautiful, meaning what can be liked by everyone. And in this, Kant stays basically true to his concept of freedom. I will come back to that soon when I get to Kant's practical philosophy, Kant's moral philosophy, and talk about what is freedom to him. But basically, and this runs like a red thread through all of his works, and you cannot understand him and his whole project as a whole without understanding this. Basically, to Kant, there's always the difference between what he calls wild freedom, unrestricted freedom, and freedom under law. And he always believes that the unrestricted wild freedom basically destroys itself. You can see that when it comes to the law of the state. Sure, we could have no state, we could have no laws. We could be free to just do whatever we want. But then the next best person I meet could murder me or could steal all my stuff. So it is better to live in a state that to some degree restricts freedom, because only through that way will your freedom actually be preserved. The same, Kant would say, goes for your own individual actions. Sure, you could just freely follow your instincts and drives. If you don't like someone, hit him, beat him up. If today you want to sleep in till afternoon, okay, don't go to work, sleep in. If you want to take drugs, if you want to drink, if you want to eat unhealthy food as much as you want, sure, do that. But you will probably find that being free in that wild manner will very soon lead you to lose your freedom. While if you restrict your own freedom, in this case through your own reasons, through understanding that certain actions, that blindly following certain drives is not a good idea, you will actually preserve your freedom. And the same goes for our theoretical thought, where Kant would say, sure, we can allow ourselves to just make up whatever we want. We can be superstitious. We can be mystics. We can believe in all sorts of magic and spirits and so on that go against the laws of nature. But then we basically kill off our own ability to understand the world and to deal with the world. If we understand the world through scientific laws of nature, we can use them, for example, for technology, for dealing with the world. But if we believe in all sorts of spooky, unseen powers, we never really know what to do or what to expect. So Kant's concept of freedom is always about restricting the wild freedom in order to preserve actual freedom. And this, I think, is also true when it comes to art. The genius, in its wild freedom, could produce all sorts of works of art, could produce with his spirit all sorts of wild and original expressions for his aesthetical ideas. But this would be like the ravings of a madman. It would not appeal to other people. And thereby, it would defeat art itself. Art would stop being beautiful. Art would stop being liked by people, bringing pleasure to people, and people would not view that art anymore. So it is better, Kant would advise the genius, the artist, it is better to restrict your own genius, to restrict your own spirit through the rules of taste, and only be spirit rich, sure, be a genius. Don't just be an imitator. Don't just produce trivial art that gives some superficial pleasure and entertainment, but nothing more. But still do it within the bounds of good taste. And do it in a form that people will actually like and enjoy. And in this way, you could say that the critique of the power of judgment, where Kant deals with the beautiful and with art and with the genius, has a similar aim as his other two critiques. That is, Kant's aim in his whole critical project is always more of a negative than a positive one. It is not about expanding, but rather about restricting. Kant says, and I mentioned that in the lecture on what is science, he says that a science can be a doctrine, expanding our knowledge, but it can also serve as a discipline, restricting us. And to him, the critique is supposed to be a discipline. So in the critique of pure reason, Kant shows that, yeah, sure, metaphysicians tried to expand our knowledge beyond the realm of experience. They wanted knowledge about the supersensual. They wanted knowledge about life after death, about God. Well, Kant tries to discipline our faculty of cognition and to tell us this is not possible. Stay within the bounds of experience. Do natural science. Here you can have actual cognition. But you cannot have cognition of things that you can only think, but that you cannot view. Well, in the critique of practical reason, Kant deals with our actions. And here, many people just want to follow their drives, just want to follow their inclinations, and just want to pursue their own happiness. Even if maybe it means disregarding the rights of other people. Well, the moral law, the categorical imperative, about which I will soon talk in future lectures, does not tell us that we are not allowed to become happy. Kant would say, sure, do go after your own happiness. Just like in the theoretical, he would say, sure, do pursue knowledge, do try to have cognitions, but try to become happy, follow your drives and inclinations within the bounds of the moral law. So within the bounds that other people's rights and the reverence, the regard you ought to have for their rights set your actions. Well, in the same spirit, Kant writes his critique of the power of judgment. So here it is a bit less obvious, therefore it is more often overlooked. But I find it unfortunate that people don't talk about this more when talking about the critique of the power of judgment and when talking about his aesthetics. Because only if you understand this can you really understand how it fits within this whole project. Well, here too, Kant basically says, um, don't endlessly expand. Genius should not just be creative and original and always produce new things, new ideas, or new expressions of its ideas, but rather have some discipline. Oh, artist, restrict yourself by whatever good taste dictates. Of course, there's a difference when you compare to the other two critiques, and that is maybe also why Kant here is not quite as clear, and why this intention of his is often overlooked. And that is that, unlike in the theoretical science or in the practical science and morality, um, there is not really a rule that can be given. Like, you cannot give a proper rule to the intellect of what good taste is. Um, it is something everyone has to judge for himself. So, therefore, the critique itself, the critique of the power of judgment, cannot serve as a discipline, as the critique of pure reason or the critique of practical reason can. It can only sort of show that a discipline is needed and that every artist should discipline himself. It can only sort of tell the artist or the wannabe artist that he should be mindful of creating something tasteful, creating something beautiful. But it cannot tell him how exactly that is done. Of course, we find Kant listened to very little nowadays. In the lecture on what is art, I said that to Kant there is this more trivial entertainment art, the mere pleasant art. And then there's the beautiful art, which according to him is supposed to be art of the genius. Well, I think nowadays we will find that those who claim that they are doing more than just entertainment, more than just pleasant art, they very much want to be geniuses, even if they won't use that word. But they, to even much larger degree than those wannabe geniuses of Kant's time, those young poets of the Sturm und Drang period, think that genius is just about originality. It is just about doing your own thing. And they think that not minding the rules of taste, not trying to be tasteful, is even a testament to their genius. Look at all those modern poets and musicians and architects and directors and so on, who want to create higher art, not just pop culture. You often find that what they create is something that no one can really like, that no one really finds beautiful, something very grotesque and distorted, very intellectualized. So surely they are thinking a lot of things, and all the high art critics can also think a lot of things and talk about a lot of things when seeing these artworks. But even if we put aside whether this intellectualization really is the mark of genius, even if they do have genius, what they don't have is taste. They often produce things that you can think everything about. So I guess in some way you could say they are vivifying and they offer a lot for interpretation. So if you want, in some way you could say they have spirit, but they don't have taste. They sometimes, those modern artists, they create pictures or installations or concept art that don't really seem to represent anything, that are not pictures of something, that are just shapes and forms, or just a banana taped to a wall, or just a glass of water. And it is not beautiful in its form. I think it is quite telling as a symptom of this development that nowadays we have people who are called artists and just artists. That's something that in Kant's day didn't exist, right? Artist is sort of an umbrella term, but classically, every artist was a specific artist, like he was a painter or a sculptor or an architect or a composer or a poet. But nowadays you have some people who are just artists, because you cannot say that they are doing literature or music or painting. There is no word for what they are doing. They themselves could not tell you what it is they are doing when they are putting a glass of water somewhere, or just a bunch of butter smeared in a corner or whatever. And this is genius, or even, let's leave that aside whether it really is genius, but at least it is assumed genius without any restrictions of taste. And these modern artists would probably even agree to that. They would say, yeah, I'm not trying to be tasteful. Maybe I am even trying to breed with taste, to create something that is grotesque or obscene, that people will not like and find beautiful, but rather find shocking or repulsive or whatever. Many of these modern artists would take pride in their tastelessness, and they would say that taste is like a straitjacket restricting you, not allowing the free expression of artistic genius. And well, the thing is, Kant would not disagree with them. He would say, yes, taste does restrict you. It does cut away at the wings of genius with which it freely wants to fly away. But he would say that is a good thing. And you need to have some self-restraint. He would say, just like the state with its laws restricts the wild freedom of the natural state, but thereby gives you true freedom and security, so taste should restrict the freedom of the artist. This is like those Americans who are gun obsessed and who will say it is their freedom to own guns. Well, yes, but this freedom also includes the freedom of others to run amok at a school and to kill a bunch of children. I would rather have less freedom. I would rather have people in my society not own guns, and therefore have the freedom to go to school without fear. And just like I find it silly to be proud of your gun ownership and of this American freedom, I very much find it silly when an artist is proud of his tastelessness in that way. Only if you understand this concept of freedom Kant has, and his aim at disciplining the wild freedom, only then, as I already said, can you really understand how the critique of the power of judgment fits within his whole project. Because only then can you understand that Kant, in all of his works, is a philosopher not just in the school sense, but in the world sense. I talked about this in my lectures on what is philosophy and metaphysics and wisdom to Kant, specifically the lecture on wisdom, because to Kant there is the philosopher in the school sense, the metaphysician, who wants to, like any scientist, acquire certain knowledge, understand certain things, certain phenomena. But Kant's aim is not just to understand, to merely understand the phenomenon of beauty, or of taste, or of the genius. But rather, he says, the philosopher in the world sense should be the wise person, the sage. He should be the one who understands the true purpose of humanity, who understands where we should go, what our goals should be. And therefore, Kant describes him, and I explained in that lecture, as the lawgiver of reason. So the one who tells us what we ought to do, which laws we ought to follow. And I said also in that lecture that everyone should, not in a school sense, but in this wider world sense, as a wise person, be a philosopher. Everyone should give a law to himself. That is the moral law. And I think Kant here very much is such a philosopher in the world sense, giving a law to the artists, the law of taste, telling them you should follow that law. It should restrict your genius. And we can find, however, that there has been, especially in the last century, so after Kant, in the 20th century, there has been this breach in history, in the history of art. There has been this moment when quite suddenly, almost from one generation to another, the old rules didn't apply anymore. The classical forms of art didn't matter anymore, and artists let go of all the rules. And this, I think, is no coincidence. It is a symptom of something bigger. It is a symptom of the negative Aufklärung that happened. So, of Aufklärung only being done half the way. That is, we aufklärt ourselves in the sense that we let go of the old authorities, which in the realm of art means the authority of good taste, the authority of the classical examples of what is beautiful art. And positive Aufklärung, however, has not yet happened. That is starting to lead ourselves through reason, through the one true authority, the one authority that is not arbitrary, but that we really should be followed because we ourselves understand that it should be followed. That has not yet happened. We are in that middle phase that is, in a way, the worst phase of all, where people believe in nothing, where nihilism and relativism reign. That phase which Nietzsche, living when it started, living after the age of Aufklärung, has very much described and criticized. And in this age of liberalism, that is of blind, of arbitrary freedom, of wild freedom, of everyone just doing whatever he wants, which leads to the state that higher art is in now. In this stage, it's almost necessary that we get what we get now. And I would agree with Nietzsche that this is a stage that humans will never come out of again. Not as humans, but only as superhumans, as Übermenschen. But that goes beyond Kant. That is a matter for future lectures when I will talk about Nietzsche. But with Kant, I think we can at least understand this phenomenon, and we can understand where we are now, so to say, in history, or here more specifically in the history of art. But here I want to make an important digression, because nowadays those who criticize this kind of modern art, concept art, the loudest, are often right-wingers. And I have heard criticism of their criticism, like I've read articles, I've seen videos here on YouTube that basically say if you take issue with modern art, with abstract art, with concept art, then you are basically a fascist. Now, personally, I don't know what your definition of fascism is. My definition of fascism isn't wanting to live in a city with beautiful buildings. But still, it makes you, let's say, suspicious when you criticize this modern art. People may suspect you too just being such a right-winger, such a conservative. And this is, of course, not just true when it comes to art. The same is true for other topics. Like here in Germany, for example, the left very much has pushed, as they call it, gender-sensitive language. And this has been attacked by the right in turn, which also leads to a situation where if you criticize this gender language, if you don't use it, then you are usually suspected of being some sort of right-winger, some sort of conservative. But of course, two people can have an outwardly similar opinion or do what outwardly seems to be a similar thing for entirely different reasons. Like if you have two people who are both vegetarian, then yeah, sure, as vegetarians they don't eat meat. But it's possible that one of them doesn't eat meat for health reasons and the other doesn't eat meat for moral reasons, because of the animals or because of the climate impact or whatever. So really it's not enough to just say, oh, they are vegetarian, they are the same. You have to actually listen to the reasons they are giving. And for sure it is true that many right-wingers and that many fascists do take issue with modern art. I mean, just think back to Trump's first presidency, when he made a law, a decree or whatever, saying that new federal buildings being built in the US had to all be built in a neoclassical style. They could not be built as modern architecture. What is behind this issue that the right takes with modern art? Be it modern architecture, modern paintings, whatever. For one, I think it's simply their anti-intellectualism, which they display in other areas as well. They just hate everything that is, well, intellectual, that is complicated to them, that they don't understand. And this is what you can find in a lot of criticism of modern art or of concept art. The criticism is terribly shallow and primitive and basically boils down to, haha, how stupid, how can that be art? Like, for example, there's one artwork, it's called an oak tree, and it consists of a glass of water. And besides that glass of water, there's a text by the artist explaining that this is not a glass of water, this is an oak tree. And this work of art relates to the old Christian teaching of the transubstantiation. That is, when you eat the bread and when you drink the wine in the Eucharist, it's supposed to be the flesh and the blood of Jesus, right? And it is supposed to not just symbolize them. I mean, this depends on which church, which theology you are following. But at least classically, it's supposed to not just symbolize them, but to literally be the flesh and the blood of Jesus. And you are supposed to drink this wine and not imagine that you are drinking wine, but that you are drinking the blood of Jesus. And in the same way, the artist tells you this glass of water doesn't just symbolize an oak tree, it is an oak tree, and you are supposed to take it as an oak tree. Now, I read here on YouTube in the comments, I read people making fun of that work of art. And the criticism boiled down to people saying, ha ha ha, how can this be art? It's just a glass of water. I fill a glass with water every morning and then drink it. Am I an artist now? I should start taking millions of dollars for the glass of water I'm filling. And this is just stupid. No, you are not an artist for filling a glass of water, because I assume when you fill that glass of water, you just do it to drink. You probably don't think of the Eucharist, and you probably don't come up with this thought that this glass of water could be an oak tree. Now, you can, of course, criticize that work of art on other grounds. You could criticize that the thought that this artwork expresses, when it makes this relation with the Eucharist, is not a thought worth expressing. Or maybe you could say, as a criticism, what this artwork tries to say has worth, should be said, but the artwork doesn't say it in a good way. It shouldn't be expressed in this manner by using a glass of water and claiming it's an oak tree. You could bring forth such a criticism. But my point is that the criticism that I read, and not just of this artwork, but of others too, is just criticism that shows that the critic simply doesn't get it. It's not that the critic says, I got it, but I still think for those and those reasons that what I got was wrong or was stupid or whatever, but just they don't get it. They just say, haha, it's just a glass of water, haha, it's just a banana taped to a wall, without caring, without asking, why is there a glass of water? Why is there a banana? What does it say? Again, they don't say what it says should not be said or what it says is wrong. They just refuse to acknowledge that it says anything. And thereby, again, they display their anti-intellectualism. And it's of course not just that they don't get it. And again, this anti-intellectualism is very common for the right-wingers. And it's not just when it comes to art. The same, again, is here in German when we have this gendered language. So the thing in German is that you don't just say, let's say, teacher or worker as in English, and it could be a man or a woman. But in German, it's much more common to have a word for the male person and a word for the female person. Like in English, you have with actor and actress or waiter and waitress, but in German, we have this for every word, basically. And this gender language is about not using the regular word like teacher for a group of both male and female teachers, because the claim is that this is the male word, this is a generic masculine plural, and the demand is to use both the male and the female word. So to basically say teachers and teachresses, if that word existed in English. And the feminists, they will talk about how this makes women visible in language. And again, I find the right-wingers who are against this. And I say that as a person who doesn't use this gender language and who has many reasons to dislike that gender language, but I find them to just not engage with the argument. They just refuse to even acknowledge the reasons that are given why we should speak this way. And they just say, oh, this is raping the language. This is destroying the German language, as if those of all people cared about the German language. If you knew German and if you listen to them, their German is terrible. So yeah, this anti-intellectualism is about simply not acknowledging the argument, not acknowledging the reason given. But of course, it goes beyond just not understanding. Those people also get angry at not understanding. They hate when they are made to feel stupid or uneducated or whatever. That is one reason for them to hate intellectuals and to hate anything that is too complicated to them. It's like an inside joke, or it's like a riddle that they can't solve, and that makes them resentful. This reminder that there's a lot of things that go beyond their horizon. And I mean, as Nietzsche showed, fascism in general is driven by resentment. It is driven by not so much open and direct hatred, but by this inner hatred that gnaws at your own heart. Or as Wilhelm Reich showed, it's not just resentment in general, but rather it's very much resentment against life. Fascism is basically a death cult. They want to destroy life itself, because they feel betrayed by life. They feel not really alive. They feel scared of life. They hate life, and so they want to destroy life and resent it. And as a side note, I think that Kant's whole theory of pleasure and pain, which I discussed in a previous lecture, very much helps understanding this, because as I explained there, Kant says that pleasure is a feeling of my own life, of my own vitality. And on the other hand, pain is a feeling of life being blocked, life being diminished. So here, when there is something that they don't get, something that goes beyond their intellect, something that is too complicated for them, that is basically a blocking of their life, right? Their intellect can't deal with this, can't understand this, so they feel their life force, or more specifically in this case their intellectual force, attacked and blocked, and that is felt as some sort of displeasure. But it goes further than that. This anti-intellectualism of the right, it's not just that they dismiss things simply because they don't get them. It's also not just that they hate the fact that they don't get it, and that they get angry and resentful about it. But rather they have, in a way, very good reason for their gross and primitive materialism and objectivism. They have a reason to reject all sorts of idealism and to attack them or to make fun of them. They have a reason to claim that whatever they hold to be true simply is the obvious truth, and it's just common sense and common reason that this is true. It doesn't even need any proof, any arguments. It's just obviously true. And the reason for that is that it frees them, it liberates them from all sorts of responsibility. If idealism is true, if consciousness makes being, then I'm responsible for how I experience the world, because it's not that I just experience the world as it is, but as I make it, as I choose to look at it. It's then the perspective I choose to take. But if I pretend that the way I see the world just is how the world is, then I'm not responsible for it, right? So if I have opinions that are racist or that demean women or whatever, I can just say, well, it's not my fault. Those are just the facts. I can just say, as right-wingers like to say, facts don't care about your feelings, right? So I can say things like, I don't know, immigrants or black people or whatever, they commit more crimes, or they have a lesser IQ or whatever. And that's just a fact. The statistic shows it. It's not my fault for pointing out the fact. It's just the objective fact. And I don't have to acknowledge that I choose to look at the world like this. I choose to pick this group of, let's say, criminal people and to say, oh, they are immigrants, they are black people, that must be the reason for their crimes. It can't be that they are also maybe poor people from a bad socio-economic background, and that is the reason for their crimes. And it also can't be that the system is racist, that maybe a white person and a black person committing the same crime will not get the same punishment on average, but the black person will get a harsher punishment by the judge. No, it can't be that. So I don't have to acknowledge, with this anti-intellectualism, responsibility for how I view the world. I can pretend that this is just how the world is, and that there is no other possible way to view it except wrong ways by naive and idealistic leftists who don't want to see the truth because it hurts their feelings. But I would also say that this whole anti-intellectualism is not the only reason why right-wingers hate modern art. Another reason is their soulless conservatism. I mean, they hate anything new. They hate modern art because they hate modernity in general, not just its art. This again is true not just for their dismissal of modern art, but also for other things they hate. Again, like political correctness, like new rules of speaking, of which words to use or not to use because they are allegedly racist. Again, you could attack this for other reasons. You could say that this political correct language is the wrong way to fight things like racism. And I do say that. But they hate it, at least that's one of the reasons, simply because it's new. Simply because it's a change to how things used to be. Just like modern art is new and brings change with it. And they hate change as such. Because, well, every sort of change poses a challenge. Every sort of change demands of me that I change too, that I seek a new orientation, that I somehow respond to that change. That is what life is. Nietzsche would say life is about dancing, being able to dance, not being rigid and solid. But that is exactly what those right-wingers are. They are rigid and solid. They can't change. Of course, they may deny this. When you say that they are enemies of progress, of movement, of change as such, they may say that they are not against society progressing, that they just believe it's progressing in the wrong direction. But the thing is, have you ever heard them say that another direction would be better? Have you ever seen any suggestions how they would like society to move forward? No, they wanted to move backward. It's in the very name, conservative. They don't want something new, they want to conserve the old, as they say. Yeah, or look at the USA, where they talk about make America great again. It's not make it greater than it ever was. It's not let's move forward to a newer and greater America. No, make it great again. Let's go back to some past. Of course, that's usually a past that never existed. It's just imagined. That's another matter. But my point here is they have no concept of how they would like to move forward. That is exactly why you don't find them just criticizing modern art, which would be well and fine on its own, but you don't find them try out new forms of art instead that are different from modern art, but still also different from what came before. No, instead, all they can ever think of is just going back to the old forms of art. Again, think of this decree of Trump in his first term to only build federal buildings in a neoclassical style. I mean, as if the classical architecture of the Romans, as if that is it forever. That is how you have to build buildings now, and there can never be anything new or any progress or any change. I mean, it would have been one thing if the decree had been to always build beautiful federal buildings, no matter in which style, no matter if it's an old style that is revived or if it's some new style of architecture that someone comes up with. But no, they only want to go back to the old, to what has already been there. They lack the imagination, they lack the fantasy to come up with something new, and they are also too weak. They fail too much at life, at this moving, changing, dancing. They don't want to have to deal with something new, with something unknown. I mean, that's also one of the reasons why they hate immigrants. So for that very reason, I refuse to be lumped in together with them when I criticize modern art, because I don't do it out of anti-intellectualism. I mean, I'm an intellectual myself, for what it's worth. I don't do it because I don't understand this modern art. And also, I don't do it out of conservatism. I'm not saying that you can only do the old styles of art. In fact, for example, my favorite poet is Paul Celan, Jewish German poet who, after the Holocaust, wrestled with the German language, which he loved, but which also was, of course, the language of the murderers of his family. And his poems, they are not classical poems. Like they don't usually rhyme or anything. So it's not that I am someone who only wants the old style of poetry, of architecture, or whatever. I'm very much open for new styles if they are good, if they are beautiful, if they are ingenious. I just believe that this is not the case when it comes to not all, but a lot of what passes for high art nowadays. So you can say that yes, when right-wingers, not everyone, but right-wingers, when they are against modern art, then yes, it is because they are fascists. Because after all, fascism is against pluralism, against dancing, against having a dialogue, against life, because all of that is too challenging. What fascism is about is what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung. So, coordination, for lack of a better translation. So, making everything and everyone the same. Everyone having to march along in lockstep behind the leader, or even without the leader in perfect fascism. Fascists want everything to be the same because they don't want to be challenged. And in that way, if you consider Kant's concept of what a genius is, as I already described it in the previous lecture, genius as the spirit of originality, genius as he who produces something original that is not original nonsense like the madman produces, but that is exemplary so others can follow it. That means, I would say, that fascism is like the antithesis to genius. Because while the genius is original, and while the genius is a leader, a commander, a lawgiver, someone who shapes the world, the fascist hates originality and individuality. The fascist wants the faceless mass, everyone to be the same, to look the same, to think the same. And the fascist does not want to lead, to shape the world, but rather the fascist wants to mindlessly follow. And in that sense, I would say fascism is actually about nothing else but a rebellion of sorts of the non-geniuses against genius. And fascism tries to destroy and to make impossible the genius. I would even, as a side note, I would even go so far as to say that this explains the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Because if you think about it, about Kant's concept of the genius, you could say that the Jews represent genius on the level of not the individual, but on the level of peoples. That is not to say that individual Jews, that they are all geniuses. I'm not racist enough to claim that Jews are some sort of other species from other people. So, of course, individual Jews can be geniuses or can be non-geniuses just as much as individual Gentiles. But my point is that taken as a whole, taken as a people, the Jews do represent genius in history. They are a people of originality and of exemplary originality. I mean, just look at the form of religion they came up with, which was very original in antiquity, and then look how that was taken as exemplary by other people, by the European people, by the Arab people, and how the Europeans with Christianity basically followed the genius, the original example of the Jews, including the German master race, which the Nazis claimed to belong to, which wasn't a race that led, but a race that followed the Jewish example. And so it makes sense, if you hate genius, if you want to destroy genius, to, of course, fight individual geniuses, and the Nazis, of course, did that too, fighting any original artist, any original thinker, but also to fight the Jewish people as such. And so you can say, considering the four components of the genius that Kant mentions, that the right-wingers, they want art to be spiritless. They want art to basically be empty, to not have anything to say to people, to not help in their cultivation, in their Aufklärung, but rather they want just the empty form. And that is precisely why the art of the fascists is never good art. I mean, what is left nowadays of the art the Nazis produced, let's say? They didn't produce anything lasting, anything with a big cultural impact, because they didn't produce art of genius. They were just what I discussed in the last lecture, following in the footsteps of actual geniuses, or rather, as again I discussed in the previous lecture on genius, they were not even following, they were aping, mindlessly copying everything, even the mistakes. And so if you look at how they depict people in their paintings and their statues, they just follow they just follow what Kant would call the normal idea of beauty. I discussed that in my lecture on the connection between beauty and freedom and morality. How the ideal of beauty of a beautiful person to Kant consists of two parts: of the normal idea how a person should look like, not looking too grotesque, but rather sort of the middle, the median of all the people you know. But then the other half of the ideal of beauty to Kant is an expression of morality in a person, and that is exactly why the paintings or the statues or whatever of Nazis lack. They just depict the normal idea of a person. So they depict the Aryan, the good-looking, blonde, blue-eyed person, but it lacks actual spirit. It lacks an actual expression of goodness, of morality, and that is why their art can never really be liked, can never really bring us pleasure. Because even if the people they depict are not ugly, there's nothing behind this perfect facade. Of course, it's not just that their art isn't liked by us because it lacks actual spirit, but rather it is actively disliked. This art, if you are somewhat aufklärt, will turn you off, will in a way disgust you, because there cannot be this interestless viewing of that art. I talked about this in my lecture on beauty, how that is important to beauty, according to Kant. But rather, when you look at that art, you feel that it is not without interest. It was not produced without interest, but rather there is a propaganda interest behind it. This art is meant to manipulate you, on top of not being good art. But anyways, my point is their art lacks actual spirit. They don't want spirit, they hate it. That's why they hate any sort of genius. Because otherwise, they would allow for new forms of art. They would allow for the genius to be original, to always find new expressions for new aesthetical ideas and thereby become exemplary for new forms of art. And they don't do that. And that is why I, even if I may criticize, very harshly criticize, certain things that nowadays pass for art, I refuse to be lumped in with some fascists who just consider anything that doesn't follow in the classical footsteps, in the classical forms of art, sort of degenerate art. Rather, this lumping in together is done by the Ausklärung. So the shallow, superficial pseudo-Aufklärung. Because to the Ausklärung, idealism and fascism seem to be the same thing. Because the Ausklärung thinks that it itself is the true Aufklärung, and in its shallowness, it can only recognize that something else, be it idealism, be it fascism, is not it, is not Ausklärung. And that's enough to reject it. And that's enough to say all these things that are not me, they must be the same. But actually, I would say that it is this ausklärt understanding of art, the ausklärt relativism, which says anything goes. Art should not be restricted by having to be tasteful, having to be beautiful. Art can be anything, and if you disagree with that, you are basically a fascist. I would claim that this ausklärt understanding of art actually has more in common with the fascist understanding of art than my or Kant's own Aufklärt understanding of art does. Because if you consider it based on Kant's concept of the genius, then you could say that both the fascist and the ausklärt person only want a half art. And the fascist only wants taste, only wants the beautiful form, but no actual spiritful content. He doesn't want art to actually be meaningful. So he wants a tree without roots, without top, most of all without any fruit from which you could actually benefit, but rather he just wants the blossoms. But on the other hand, the ausklärt relativist says the blossoms don't matter. The tree can look as ugly and as repelling as you like, or as you don't like. Art doesn't have to be liked. Art doesn't have to appeal to everyone. But rather it is enough for there to be genius. It is enough that the art has spirit, or maybe a lot of intellect, or maybe even power of imagination, but it doesn't require taste. So you can have a tree with roots and with a top and maybe with a fruit, but a tree that looks so ugly that most people will not ever want to pluck and taste its fruits. So while the fascist and the ausklärt person are opposites and want opposite things from art, they are the same in that one fact that both of them only want half of the art. While the Aufklärt position would be that art should be whole, that genius needs all four those components, that there should be a spiritful content, but also a tasteful form. And in this way, what I have been doing here is use Kant's sympathetic method. I discussed that in another lecture. The method is basically about Kant saying that there is no total error, there's only partial error. So in any position, there must be some partial truth, or the position could not appeal to anyone and could not seem true to anyone. So in any position, even in Ausklärung, even in fascism, there must be some truth, And so Kant would say we should rather try to unite them into a better middle position rather than just outright dismiss them completely. And I think that is what I have just been doing. I think that both the Ausklärung people and the fascists don't understand what art should really be. They both have a point, but they both don't have the whole thing. And we should go back to the whole thing. Because spirit is, of course, important. Art should not be empty. Art should not be shallow. Art should actually cultivate and aufklär you. But art should be tasteful. It should appeal to people. Otherwise, you have what Kant would call aesthetical egoism. When I someday get to Kant's concept of Aufklärung, I will address egoism and its opposite, pluralism, more. But Kant says, just like there's logical egoism, which to him would mean thinking that only you are right, that only your opinion matters, and not caring if others disagree with you. And just like there's moral egoism, which again means that only your moral judgment matters, and what others deem to be moral or immoral doesn't factor into your judgment. Just like that, there's also aesthetical egoism. Only caring about your own aesthetical judgment, only caring about something appealing to you, without having the pluralism, without having the humanity, Kant would say, to care about your fellow human beings and their taste. And in this way, I would say that Kant here, in his critique of the power of judgment, just like in the other critics, proves an actual philosopher. Because as I explained in my lecture on what is wisdom to Kant, to him, the philosopher, not just in the school sense of the word, where it basically means the metaphysician thinking about the superessential, but in what Kant calls the world sense of the world. The philosopher as a wise person, as a sage, the philosopher should be the lawgiver of reason. He should not just, like a regular scientist, describe what is, but with his wisdom, because wisdom is about understanding the final purpose, the actual vocation of a human being. With his wisdom, the philosopher should talk about how things should be. And that is something which Kant doesn't just do when it comes to art, when it comes to science, or when it comes to morality, but also when it comes to beauty and art. Now, before closing off this lecture and this topic of the genius, I want to make some smaller further remarks. The first of those is that when talking about the genius, Kant doesn't mention his table of categories. But the thing is that he does say this table of categories, and I discussed that in 2 earlier lectures, if you want to check those out. This table of categories is the basis of all our thinking. All thinking happens within these categories, and every thought can be understood along the lines of those categories. And Kant himself says that the architectonic is very important to him in science. That too I discussed in a previous lecture. That is, science should not just be random or look around whatever it may find, which always comes with the issue that you might overlook some things, but rather science should be architectonic. It should follow a system, and that to him is the table of categories. That is what the architectonic is based on. And that is why you should look out for numbers in Kant. And when there's a number that relates to the table of categories, the number 12, the number 3, or in this case the number 4, it should at least make you suspicious. So even though Kant doesn't outright say so, and maybe he actually in this case wasn't conscious of it, maybe he himself never made that connection, I still would say that the 4 components of the genius can probably be related to the 4 titles of categories. I would suggest that spirit is about the quantity of the genius, because the spirit is that in the genius which makes it possible for the aesthetical ideas, which otherwise would just be the ideas of one singular individual. The spirit makes it possible for them to be shared with others. The spirit gives those ideas universality. And also you could say it is spirit which brings unity between the intellect and the power of imagination, and therefore which brings unity into the mind as a whole. Second, when it comes to the quality of the genius, I would say here we have the power of imagination, because after all, genius is about having aesthetical ideas to Kant. After all, Kant says, as I already discussed in the previous lecture on genius, that the genius is first and foremost the genius artist, not so much the genius scientist. So the quality of genius to Kant is that it's not intellectual, it's aesthetical in nature. Intellect, I would say, belongs to the relation of the genius, because the aesthetical ideas are in relation precisely to the intellect's concepts, and because they make the intellect continuously keep thinking, keep reflecting about them. And lastly, and this one I'm most sure about, I would say that taste belongs to modality, because, and again, I discussed that in the lectures on the table of categories and also the table on judgments on which it is based. Kant always stresses that modality is different from the other 3 titles, in that in a way it doesn't add anything new to the thing. Kant would say that let's say 100 euros that are real, that I actually have, and 100 euros that are possible, that I just imagine, they are not different from one another. They are both 100 euros. I cannot buy more or less with one than with the other. With both, I can buy whatever 100 euros can buy. The difference is just the mode of their existence. That is, one time they exist and the other time they don't exist. They are just possible. And in the same way, taste doesn't really add anything to genius as such, as Kant says. A work of art, if it has intellect, if it has power of imagination, that is, if there are correct concepts and if there are aesthetical ideas related to that concept, and if it has spirit, that is, if it finds the right expressions to express these aesthetical ideas to others, then it is a genius work of art. And making it tasteful, making it beautiful, doesn't make it more genius. It just changes the mode in which this artwork exists and is presented to others. My second remark would be that while Kant says genius has those 4 components and none of them should be lacking completely, that doesn't mean that every genius has them in equal parts. Rather, Kant would probably say that there's never a perfect genius with a perfect balance of all four of those components, but rather in one artist this component and another artist that component um, might be more pronounced than the others. And this goes for individual artists, like maybe one artist has less taste but more spirit, or one artist doesn't have so much intellect but a very vivid power of imagination. But it also goes for whole peoples. Because in his lectures on anthropology, Kant used to address the character of peoples, which is something that nowadays you couldn't really do anymore because it would be considered unscientific and not politically correct. But back then it was pretty normal. It wasn't just something that Kant did. And when he does so, he also addresses how genius usually expresses itself in the various peoples of Europe. And he likes to say that the French people, they have the most taste. So he says when it comes to them, genius is mostly expressed in the flower, in the blossom. And that is why he says their works of art, particularly their literature, um, has the best style. Um, then there are the Italians, who, according to him, have the most vivid imagination. So their genius is more in the top and the crown of the tree, which is also, as Kant would say, why they are best when it comes to works of art in the fields of architecture or sculpturing or painting or music and the opera. So wherever the sensations that art gives, not so much the form, the beautiful form, and not so much the actual content as maybe in literature, but where the sensations that art gives off are more important. So where you need power of imagination the most, that is where the Italians excel. And when it comes to the Germans, and I will clarify that in such discussions of the characters of people, when Kant talks about Germans, he means that in a very broad way. Basically, he means all Germanic peoples except the English. So that is the Germans, the Austrians, the Dutch, the Scandinavians. Um, the Germans, their strength is the intellect, Kant would say. So their genius is mostly in the roots of the tree. And finally, the English, and again, he probably means that in a somewhat broader sense. So all the British, their genius is in spirit. So Kant would say that their works of art, particularly their literature, like Shakespeare, I already mentioned, but he also very much liked many English works of literature of his time, such as Butler's or Swift's or Sterne's. He would say they are full of very original ideas. They are full of um, great expressions that give you food for thought, that make you sing. But they often lack the taste, the proper style and their form as the French have. And this also fits with how Kant judges the scientific character of the peoples. Um, Not so much their aesthetical, their artistic character. Because here too, Kant says that the works of the French, such as Montesquieu or Voltaire, they are very refined in their style, but they are often more shallow. They have less actual content. They don't brings science forward so much. While on the other hand, the English, they are very original. They always have great new ideas. So it is great to read works by English authors such as Hume, because they give your own intellect food for thought. They make you think. They make you consider new thoughts, new perspectives. But they don't just lack the beautiful style of the French. They also often don't go in depth. That is, they don't really take their own original ideas and really think them through. And the Germans, on the other hand, Kant would say, they neither have the beautiful style of the French, nor do they have the originality and new ideas of the English. They are ruled by the spirit of following, so they take up what they get from other nations and sort of follow in their footsteps, sort of copy them, sort of imitate them. But they are very thorough. They have a very pronounced intellect and power of judgment, and they go in depth. They finalize, so to say, what, for example, the English have come up with. And I mean, that's exactly what Kant did with Hume, right? Hume was the one to discover, well, okay, causality is not something that we get from experience. But Kant was the one to understand that this is not just true for causality, but also for the other 11 categories of our thinking. And Kant was the one to explain that those come from the intellect, and we don't take them out of experience, but we need them to make experience. They are conditions of the possibility of experience. And also, Kant likes in his anthropology to talk about the classical four temperaments. And while he never relates those directly to the genius, he does relate them to the national characters of the European people. And since he relates the components of the genius to those same characters, we can maybe create an indirect relation between the temperaments and the components of genius. Namely, Kant would say that the French have a more sanguine temperament, and the Italians, they are more choleric, and the Germans, they have a phlegmatic temperament, and finally the English, they are a more melancholy people. So for Kant, being melancholy doesn't necessarily mean being sad, being depressed. It can possibly lead to that, but rather it means being more deep, being more profound. So you may take your own feelings more seriously than the sanguine person, who can be in a good mood for a short time, but then also can be in a bad mood for a short time, but then soon it's forgotten and his mood changes again. So yes, if the melancholy person gets into a bad mood, it can be very bad, profoundly bad. It can be lastingly bad. But it's not necessarily that he's saying those people are depressed or anything. But anyways, since he says that the English, they are the most melancholy people, and since he also says that they have the most spirit in their art and even in their science, and since spirit is sort of the core of what makes genius, since spirit is the actual original part of genius, we could probably say that genius is, in Kant's mind, even if he doesn't outright say so, connected somewhat to melancholy. And that is, after all, an opinion that you find expressed often. not in Kant, but by many people. There's this cliche of the melancholy of the somewhat sad artist, and here we maybe have what Kant would say about that. That yes, there is some truth to that, because the actual genius, if he if he is original, if he has some depth, some if he is profound in some way, then he must be of a melancholy temperament. Finally, and also related to this, Kant would also say that the various kinds of art, while art in general requires genius, they require different components of genius to different degrees. So he would say that when it comes to paintings, you need a vivid power of imagination, and paintings, or also sculptures or architecture, they also mostly speak to our own power of imagination as viewers of this art. While on the other hand, when it comes to poetry, to writing of any sort, Kant would say here more intellect is needed. Here you need proper concepts, you need proper understanding. I mean, the painter also needs a concept, but maybe it's fine if he has just one concept of that one object he's painting. But if you are writing a poem or a play for the theater, you need more intellect, you need more concepts, Kant would say. And this also creates a sort of hierarchy in Kant's mind of the arts. So to him, the art of writing is the highest art, while music to him is a sort of lower art. Music doesn't require genius so much. There are even passages where it seems that to Kant, music doesn't really require genius at all, isn't really part of what he calls the beautiful art. I discussed the various kinds of art in my previous lecture on what is art, but rather that he subsumes music under the merely pleasant and entertaining art. It's a little unclear sometimes. So you would say that music is nice and can bring some, well, tranquility into your soul, but it doesn't really give you ideas. It doesn't really cultivate you like higher art does. You can make of that whatever you want, of course. Kant himself doesn't seem to have been such a great fan of music. That's also when you look at his biography, at what other people said about him, he doesn't seem to have had much of a sense for music. Surely other thinkers would strongly disagree. I mean, if you look at Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, who came later, in their hierarchy of arts, music is more like the highest art. They would probably say that to them it says a lot about Kant's own lack of genius and of depth of character, that he couldn't understand something that goes beyond mere concepts, something that cannot just be thought but only felt. But be that as it may, I think it's certainly true. If you look around today at most people and the music they listen to, that in their case, music indeed is just about causing certain feelings, causing certain affections, as Kant would say. They listen to music because, not because it gives them any ideas, not because it makes them grow as people, not because it shapes and cultivates them, but rather it's just sort of a background noise in their lives that fills the emptiness. But then again, you could say when it comes to unaufklärt people, that more or less goes for all sorts of art. That also goes for them watching movies or reading books. They also don't do that to cultivate themselves. So maybe that's less about music as such and more about how many people deal with it. But again, be that as it may, that is what Kant has to say about genius and about art insofar as it is genius art, as it is beautiful art. There's one more important thing that I want to address in my next lecture, and that is the sublime, because I have now talked about the beautiful as one form of aesthetical pleasure. But in his critique of the power of judgment, Kant also discusses the sublime as a second form of merely aesthetical pleasure. So before I turn to his practical philosophy, to his philosophy of morality, I also want to discuss what he has to say about the sublime. My deep thanks be to my supporters, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lening, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pay, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung cause.